Welcome back. You're still tuned in to Salam Media. The name of the show is News and Views, and I'm your host, Salailo Makwidiri. And in a bit, we're going to be delving into a contentious topic that has stirred a heated debate in South Africa, the annual commemoration of the Battle of Bloedrivier, or as many prefer to call it, the Battle of Nome. Critics argue that these celebrations glorify colonial-era violence and racism, which ultimately fosters divisions in a country still grappling with the legacy of apartheid. Otherwise, however, you view them, the expressions of heritage and historical preservation. And to help us unpack this, we are joined by MK veteran and also EFF member of parliament and activist, Mr. Carl Niehaus. Carl has been quite vocal and critical of these events, describing them as deeply offensive and a perpetuation of white supremacy in a democratic South Africa. So we'll be unpacking a bit on that with Carl. Carl, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you giving us your time this morning.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, can you start by just explaining your stance a bit on the Bloedrivier celebrations and why you found them so problematic in the context of today's South Africa, and also just looking into South Africa's history and what we're currently grappling with today.
I think it is very important that we must understand the Battle of Nome in the context of a history where the land was stolen from the indigenous people. If you look at the history of what happened before that battle took place, the Boer colonists entered the land of the Zulu people, and then first of all they got involved in some cattle theft, and they had to return that cattle to King Dingane. And subsequently, King Dingane then assessed them as a threat to the Zulu nation. Quite correctly so, he did that. And he decided, obviously, that he could not trust these people. Again, he was absolutely correct in that assessment. When he met with a delegation of the Boer colonists led by Peter Tief, he gave an instruction at Umgungundlovu that the Boer colonists and that particular commando had to be killed. I'm on record to have said that King Dingane's assessment of what the colonists intended to do, and that was to steal the land without paying anything for it, was absolutely correct. And the history that we have subsequently seen in South Africa as it unfolded over the decades, and eventually the apartheid history that the majority of Black and especially African South Africans were subjected to, showed us that the Boer colonists were bad news for South Africa. So my view is that unfortunately King Dingane did not act fast enough after he dealt with that particular delegation of Peter Tief. He should have then dealt with the rest of the colonists and had driven them out of the traditional area of the people of Zululand and of KwaZulu today. Unfortunately, he did not act fast enough, and the consequence was the Battle of Nome, where the Boers then managed to beat the Zulu Impi, and the Boers triumphantly renamed the river, calling it the Blood River, Bloedrivier in Afrikaans, triumphantly celebrating how the blood of the Zulu soldiers was coloring the river water red. Now, this is the kind of disgusting colonial history that white right-wing Afrikaners, Boers as they still continue to call themselves, are still celebrating. And every year on the 16th of December, they go to the monument that is there on the banks of the Ncome River and celebrate this victory over the indigenous people and the stealing of the land from the indigenous people of South Africa. This is unacceptable. We surely cannot have a democratic government, a government which is still being led, although it is now being led by an ANC that is a minority party in a so-called farcical government of national unity, allowing these kinds of racist, triumphalist celebrations to take place. If you look at the footage of videos that were taken during the celebrations that took place last Monday on the 16th of December, you will see that only the old Boer colonial flags were on display, and also the old apartheid flag, under which our people suffered so much during the apartheid era. So these are people who are triumphalists in their hankering back to the old apartheid racist era. The words that they use are racist. The way in which they describe that particular battle of subjugation of the Zulu nation and of colonial incursion are totally unacceptable, and the symbols that they use are totally unacceptable. These are symbols of colonialism, of racism, and of white supremacism. And the view that I've expressed is that no government that represents the majority of people in this country, black and African, should allow such outrages to take place. I ask myself, why is that monument even allowed to be there? Why do we allow it to exist? And certainly, why do we allow these racist celebrations of a colonial racist subjugation of the indigenous people of South Africa to take place? It is unacceptable. My view is that that monument should be demolished, that anyone who wants to celebrate this particular war of subjugation by colonists should be dealt with. It is racist, it is unacceptable. There should be acts in terms of the law to prevent these racist Boers from celebrating the Battle of Nome, calling it the Battle of Bloedrivier, and those who do persist with displaying racist symbols such as those colonial flags of the Boers, of the old Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek and the old Republic of the Free State, the Vierkleur, etc., and also the apartheid flag under which apartheid was implemented in South Africa. They should be charged, they should be arrested. And if they persist with what they are doing, they do not deserve to be part of our South African nation. They deserve to end up in prison.
Carl, I would like to play a bit of a devil's advocate here, and if you can indulge me, maybe. When you look at the history of South Africa, you have figures like Shaka Zulu, for instance. He's often celebrated for, his military genius, and ultimately, building the Zulu nation through his efforts. He's also left, a legacy of violence. Shaka's wars, particularly, in the 1800s, between 1818 and 1828, if I'm not mistaken, led to the death of 1 million people. This is almost an estimate. And there were thousands of forced migrations, and they were ultimately known as the battles of Mfetrane. So, Shaga's legacy is celebrated by many, symbol of African resistance and pride, but to a lot of other people from other tribes in the southern African region, he's the opposite. His name, evoked feelings of terror. Maybe in recent history, you have the late Mangosuthu Buthelezi. Also, for instance, we know the IFP and the hostile battles in the East Rand, before 1994. But those are also lauded. They are in our history books. Those that celebrate them are allowed to celebrate them. How do you respond to that rebuttal?
It is a farcical rebuttal. It is irrelevant what the history that you now described with regards to the colonial incursion of the white colonists, the Boers. We are talking here about a resistance war that King Dengane declared against the white Boer colonists, and he was correct to do so. The Afrikaner historians and Boer historians tried to use those historical examples that you've just given to rationalize what they have done. And of course, it doesn't rationalize what they have done at all. We are talking here in this particular instance about a colonial incursion of white colonists who stole the land from the indigenous people and who have subjected the indigenous people to the most terrible horrors of dispossession and of the worst examples of racism that you can think of in the world. So to use examples about the wars that took place amongst indigenous people to try and justify your colonial subjugation of that indigenous people is simply fallacious. And it is the history that is being used by Afrikaner historians to try and justify their entirely unjustifiable actions. So I don't think the discussion that we have this morning should concentrate on whatever engagements and wars there were between the indigenous people of South Africa. This discussion is about the racism of white supremacists who continue to glorify a racist colonial subjugation of the indigenous people of South Africa, who refuse to accept a democratic South Africa where the majority of people are black and African, and to continue to insult that majority by displaying symbols of colonial subjugation, of racism, and of apartheid. And that is what this conversation ought to be about, not the kind of justifications and rationalizations that Goebbels like propagandists and Afrikaner historians are trying to feed us. I'm not interested in having that discussion. They have to account for their actions. They have to account for the subjugation of the majority of indigenous people in this country to one of the worst racist apartheid states and crimes against humanity that we have ever seen. And any attempt to glorify that, any attempt to celebrate that subjugation of the indigenous people of South Africa is not only wrong, it is a moral outrage and it is criminal. And I repeat once again that if the African National Congress had the guts and had the backbone, it would have used the provisions within our constitution that doesn't allow for racism and doesn't allow for this insult to be inflicted on the indigenous people of South Africa, the majority of black people in South Africa. It would have banned these celebrations. It would have destroyed that monument. And anyone who tried to celebrate that outrageous colonial history would have been subjected to the might of the law. And from the side of the economic freedom fighters, we are clear that when, not if, but when we eventually become the government of South Africa and get involved in government in South Africa, we will make sure that these celebrations will not be allowed to take place, and that symbols that have been erected also there at the banks of the Ncome River will be removed because they're an insult to the people of this country, and in fact, overall, they are an insult to humanity. Can you imagine Nazis in Germany being allowed to celebrate the history of racism, of Adolf Hitler, and of Nazism in this fashion that we see here in South Africa. It is utterly, totally unacceptable, and it cannot be tolerated.
I want to focus a bit on, the legal and political dimensions of this conversation. You've proposed banning these celebrations and prosecuting those who participate. Do you not think that this approach might lead to further polarization? Could it not be seen as an infringement of the rights of South Africans to express their cultural identity?
Cultural identity that boils down to racism, to a disregard for other human beings, to a disregard for the majority of South Africans. That cultural expression is racist, and as such, it is unacceptable. So to hide behind this story that you are following your culture, you have a right to express your culture, is totally unacceptable. This is what AfriForum and some of the other Boer organizations, or so-called Boer organizations, have been trying to tell us. And it is a fallacy. They are racist, and they use this idea of so-called cultural expression and cultural identity to try and justify their racism. We as a nation that come out of the history of apartheid and the terrible consequences that apartheid visited on us cannot accept any expression of racism, any expression of triumphalism about our colonial racist subjugation history. And those who say that they give that expression as a cultural expression are playing word games with us, which we should not allow. Now, you ask me whether this will lead to polarization. Acceptance of racism, acceptance of the continuation of a large part of the white community not understanding our history, not accepting how wrong apartheid was, hankering back to the old apartheid and racist system. That is what causes the worst polarization. That is what we cannot tolerate in South Africa. And no white Afrikaner Boer must think they can come and blackmail the majority of South Africans with threats that this will lead to polarization in order to justify their unbridled racism. Racism is racism, full stop. Racism in our South African historical context is fundamentally and totally unacceptable. It should be dealt with by the might of the law, and those who make themselves guilty of racism, no matter what words and what rationalizations they try to use, must face the full wrath of the law. Full stop.
And I think we're going to leave it on that note. Carl, thank you so much for giving us your time. Always a pleasure having you on Salam Media. Well, there you have it there. It was Carl Niehaus. He's an MK veteran and also an EFF member of parliament. What are your thoughts? What do you think? Do you think, there must